Shalom, I'm Dr. Deanna Dye with Foundations in Torah and Bible Interact TV. Welcome to this four-part session. It's called the Early Morning Blessings. And we're going to look at some of the blessings that take place from the time one would enter into the presence of God, or they would go into the house of God at the time of the temple was standing, right up into the incense service. So if you were going through a Hebrew Siddur or the Hebrew prayer book, these would be the services or the blessings that were said before you actually get to the time of what we would call the verses of praise or the verses of pruning. So they're all part of the morning service. Now, previously I did a series called Service of the Heart, which is an 8-part series. And that is a whole introduction of the whole idea of the prayer and how they became the substitute for the offering service. And I go into some detail about the very early morning section upon awakening and donning the talit, the tzitzit, the tefillin, that is putting on the fringes, putting on the prayer shawl, and then how the Jewish men would put the phylacteries on their head and their forearm. So that information comes in that series, the Service of the Heart. This information here in the early morning blessing starts a little bit later than that. So I'm trying to help, we're just putting a little bridge here in between the Service of the Heart and we actually get into the prayers that I call the verses of praise. So this all is about a 4-part series here. So we're going to talk about the entering into the house. We're going to look at the washing of the hands and mention the burnt offering, although not into the detail that we did in the Service of the Heart series, and talk about the incense service. So really this little section encapsulates the idea of from Genesis to Revelation, from entering into the house from the very first word, Bereshit, all the way to Revelation, when we see in the book of Revelation sort of the pouring out of the plagues from the bowls of incense. So there's all that is covered, if you will, in this little section here. So again, this is just a 4-parter, sort of sandwiched in between these other blessings. Now, in order to go through this, we've got to lay a little bit of groundwork and talk about the concept here of the morning blessings, are in Hebrew, Berchot HaShachar. Berchot HaShachar just means the blessings of the morning. And everything comes down to this word berchot, comes from birchat, or a beracha, you might recognize as a blessing. And it over time became a very special kind of prayer. And in fact, those of you familiar with the prayer service know that practically every prayer begins with some sort of beracha, baruch atah, or something along those lines. And so this was introduced really at the time of Ezra and the men of the Great Assembly, but it's become very foundational. All the prayers begin that way, and so too this section that we're dealing with, the early morning blessings, start the same way, beracha. Now it comes from the very root barach, a beit, a resh, and a chet. And basically that word means to kneel. And so it is part of the synagogue service. As I said, it's in response to a wide variety of daily blessings. It's all the prayers are easy to recognize in that regard because they start with baruch, meaning blessed. The idea of something being dedicated to our Heavenly Father. So again, this is the very root of the meaning of the word, to bow one's knee, because baruch means knee. So it's the practice of showing respect by bending the knee or by bowing. So that's the root of the word. Now we're going to start, well, let me just go back over this. Again, the root is the knee, to bend or to bow. You can see that there. Now we'll, birkat, comes from baracha, or blessing. And then again, a special kind of prayer really associated with every single prayer that we know of. And the plural you might recognize, berachot, and also they all begin the same way. The early morning blessings start with something called Ma Tov. And the idea is that one is entering into the presence of God. So we kind of see a little picture here. And it starts out, how goodly are your tents, O Jacob, your dwellings, O Israel. This is a good example of Hebrew parallelism, where the second line kind of repeats what the first line is saying. But the idea is entering into the presence of God, either entering into his tent, entering into his courtyards, entering into his very dwelling place, entering into the temple, entering into the tabernacle, whatever it may be. So, of course, at home, even though you're not entering into a temple, tabernacle, or whatever, you are entering into his presence as you just prepare yourself to come into his presence in prayer. Now, we saw in that picture the talit sort of forming a tent. Now, the men and today women, and certainly in the Reform movement, women will put on their talit to enter into his presence. The idea is you're actually coming into a tent. The talit is kind of a picture of a tent. And it's the compelling thing about the prayer service is that God comes and dwells amongst his people. And if you think about that and you compare that sort of with the Tower of Babel, if you will, that those that made and constructed tower were building a tower for man to reach up into heaven. But in Hebrew thinking and understanding God the Father and who he is that he comes down, if you will, and dwells in our presence. These are very opposite concepts. So man strives to make himself be in the presence of God versus as you're there resting, you've made the decision to come into his presence. God comes and dwells with you. In his presence, you are there with him, but he has chosen to dwell among his people. It's not like the gods of this world in which one must strive to reach them. It is that God comes and dwells among us. Now, there are an assortment of scriptures that go with this particular prayer. It's not just one sort of quote, but you can find that from Numbers 24. Psalm 5:8 would be the next line. The third line would be from Psalm 26:8. The fourth line from Psalm 95:6, and the fifth from Psalm 69:14. So the prayer is constructed of all these different verses from these Psalms, and we're going to read the whole thing so you can see what I mean. Again, we started out, how goodly are your tents, your dwelling places, O Israel. Again, an example of what we call Hebrew parallelism, which is something that's found all over Scripture, especially in the Psalms. There are many, many examples of Hebrew parallelism. And so when we, let me just move ahead here on this, the place that one enters into the presence of God, or this entering in this Ma Tov idea, is said to be Israel's tents compared to the place of learning and prayer for the whole community. So that's the key. The tents, whether it was the tabernacle, whether it was the tents of the patriarch, or whether it was the temple, the tents was said to be the place of learning and prayer. And that's, of course, again, because God came and dwelt in their presence. This is the place where God's glory would be found, dwelling among the tents of Israel. This is the place of sort of the worship and truth, if you will, that God dwells in his community. So even though you're at home praying by yourself, so are a lot of other people all over the world praying alone during this time of the early morning blessings all over the world. So there is a community created all over the world, even though you find yourself home alone, if that's the place that you're praying. So it's kind of it's an ingathering of the people in prayer, even though we're separated and scattered through the four corners of the world. So this prayer that we're getting to, Ma Tov, is basically the prayer recited upon entering the synagogue or upon entering into the prayer time in your home, and expresses great feelings of reverence and joy for the Father upon entering into his presence. Really the only religion, if you will, in which one has an act of blessing that helps one enter into the presence of God, where one doesn't have to strive to find God or reach him by doing this, that, or the other, but a simple act of obedience, of blessing, that is bowing the knee in submission and humility, causes God to come and dwell in this, in his presence. We are in his presence. Now, the first use of the word ohel, the tents, is actually the meaning is light, ohel, but we find the tents of the patriarchs as one of the major places of where God came in his presence was. Certainly the first tent, if you will, was the tabernacle that they constructed in the wilderness. But after that, before that period of time, the tents of the patriarch were the precursor to the tabernacle that would be constructed. And so God dwelt among his people, which at the time of the patriarchs would be Abraham, Isaac, Yitzhak, and Jacob, Yaakov. Those are our three patriarchs, and those are the tents that it's compared to. The tents being an allusion really to the place where the people of God worship. So all that was the community of God at the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That was the central place where the people worshipped God. The tent of the tabernacle really, the tent of the patriarch really did function like the temple that would be built eventually. Solomon would construct, and then the second temple under King Herod. So as they entered into those tents, it was just as though they expressed the same kind of awe and reverence for entering into the actual sanctuary of God. Really, the sanctuary of God goes all the way back to the beginning, the Garden of Eden. That was the first sanctuary, Gan Eden. And so how one approached God at Gan Eden is no different than how one approached God at the time of the patriarchs, is no different than how one approaches God today. It's all been the same. And so the Ohel, the light, God's light, his Shekinah, is present in this place. And you know that the tents of the patriarch were the place of hospitality out in the middle of nowhere. When one would come across the tents, one would go there for comfort, hospitality, and certainly spiritual comfort and spiritual hospitality, because that would be the place that God dwelled. The tents of the nomads, this is kind of key because, of course, their early life was all nomadic. They went from place to place with their flocks looking for places to pasture. Obviously, the key ingredient in all this was water. So we have the imagery, certainly in Genesis, in many different cases, of the shepherd of Israel moving and wandering through the wilderness, through the desert, moving around according to the various seasons. And so once they would settle in a certain place for a certain period of time in that season, but then when the season ended, they would get up and they would move to another place, always in search of water. Kind of reminds me a little bit of our own lives, that, our lives are set in seasons. And for a certain season of your life, certain things are happening, you're involved with certain people, God is moving in your life in a certain spiritual way. But then that season ends, and then it's time to move on, looking for, if you will, new water. Now, this moving around, the tents had to be constructed and put up every time they moved, which I can imagine was a pain. I even think about going camping and having to put up the tent and take the tent down and put it up. And if you're, camping different places from night to night, that could be, it drove me crazy. But imagine out there in these great giant tents, and actually the women were the ones responsible for putting them up and taking them down, if you can imagine. But the tents had two major areas in them, and these areas were separated one from another. So the front section was the sort of public area used for all kinds of work. Was open to visitors. Certainly when visitors came, this is the place that they would come into. This was their very sort of public open area. And the men of the family, they would gather here in sort of the front part of the tent. And when there would be other sort of gatherings, that was the main meeting place, was in the front of the tent. Now, the front of the tent was also where sort of judging occurred, where all business was conducted. In fact, the men ate their meals here in the front of the tent. The front was generally left open in warm weather to get the breeze and the sun coming through. The rear part of the tent, though, was the very private part, and there was a dividing curtain that separated it. So if you think about the time of the patriarchs, this is how the tent was. This is how we move into the various parts when we get to the construction of the tabernacle, where there would be two parts to the tent, the sort of public open part, and then the part that was the private part where one would meet with God. Certainly the high priest would meet with God. All constructed going back to the nomads at the time of certainly the time of the patriarchs and even earlier. Again, the rear part was the private part. A dividing curtain separated. You think about the curtain dividing the holy place from the Holy of Holies. This is the place where the women slept and their children and their babies basically lived. And so they were very much separated from the public area into this more private area where the women dwelled and took care of the family functions. The tents were made from goat hair and dark sheep's wool, and they were woven in rectangular strips on looms. It's hard for me to conceive of having to haul these looms through the desert to add new tent panels, but that's what they did, and I don't know how complex their looms were. Certainly they would have been easy to pack up and travel with. The tents were also made with ropes that were tethered from the tent to the ground. And again, I mentioned that the women were the ones responsible for constructing these tents. Now they would weave the fabric for the tents, and then they'd stitch the panels together. So they would weave the sections in panels, and then the panel would be sewn one to another. And so as the house grew, as more children came into the house, they had to enlarge their tents. So we see that expression used a lot of times in Scripture, talking about enlarging the tents, which of course God is talking about the kingdom, because the kingdom expands in the same way the tent expands. As new children come in, it grows. There's no limited space or limited amount of room. The tent continues to expand. The idea of the panels actually is related to the idea of sons, because sons were the ones that were considered to be how the family grew. It grew through the line of sons, and so the panels represented the sons. And we can kind of compare that with the kingdom of heaven and the sons of God. Help the tent expand, help the kingdom expand as it grew. And so there's a very much a parallel then between the believers and the kingdom, this adding on as there was with the tents. So the tents were really kind of a visual picture of what was going on in the kingdom. The word for sons, ben, in Hebrew, a beit and a nun, if you broke that word down, the beit means a house, and the nun is a sort of a continuing seed. So the continuing seed of a house is a son, and that's how the ancient Hebrews understood the house to be built. Now, of course, the tabernacle comes along at Mount Sinai. At the foot of Mount Sinai, God calls them to construct the tabernacle, and it's really just a big, giant tent for the whole community. So the tents they'd been living in were obviously familiar with them. That's where they lived, ate, slept, and did everything they needed to do to preserve the family and cause the family to grow. So the tabernacle just became the big tent in which the place that God would come and dwell among them. But so it was basically designed in a similar way after the tents of the patriarchs, obviously more complex, and with the addition of all the various services and the furniture and how it was constructed, etc. So just as the tent, every time the clan had to move, the tent had to be packed up in a certain way, in a way that was logistical, that was made it easy to move. So too the tabernacle had that same design. Everything, every piece of furniture, every part of the tabernacle had to be wrapped up in a very certain way, carried in a certain way by certain priests, and this was very important. Of course, in nomadic life, they had to select a very suitable site for their time when they would move. In the summertime, they would want to be up on the hilltops so they could catch the breeze. And in the wintertime, for instance, they would want to be on the leeward side of the valley and above the base so that they would avoid any kind of flash floods. Certainly in that area, they were prone to flash floods when the rains came, kind of like what we're familiar with here in New Mexico. So again, the women were the ones responsible for packing up the tent and moving it. Now, they used what they call wooden mallets, if you will, and tent pegs to make sure the tent was secure. So this is just an artist's rendition. You have an example here. This is sort of the outer courtyard area, the panels that went around that in the tabernacle. And you see each post there having to be secured. Interesting, that word there for tent peg is a term that's used for Yeshua the Messiah, that he was the tent peg, if you will, the yoted that would secure the community. So these tent pegs would secure the panels that were around the tabernacle. And so again, when it was time to move, they had to take down the tent, they had to take down all these panels and all these posts and all these lines and all the tent pegs and everything everything they needed to secure the tent had to be taken down, packed up, and moved again. Obviously, the women who did this had to be very skilled in this and very efficient. They had to be able to do it quickly, and they had to be able to do it in a way that, again, once they got to their new place, it was easy to unpack and erect once more. They couldn't do it in a haphazard way. You know what it's like when if you don't put your tent away properly, and the next time you go camping and you can't find the parts and the tent's all messed up, it's not folded properly, and you can't remember which end goes where because you didn't put it back properly. So this was very key in the life of the nomad. And so the women knew how to work together efficiently and as a group in order to make this work, to be able to move from place to place. So it's a lot more complex than we think about it. All we have is our camping experience, but this was their life. So here we're going to go through some of the psalms that are in this prayer, Ma Tov, O how goodly. And this particular, from Psalm 5:8, it says, "As for me, through your abundant kindness, I will enter your house. I will prostrate myself before your holy sanctuary in awe of you." Now, this particular verse was picked because it had 10 words in it. And 10 pointed to the 10 Commandments, and 10 pointed to a quorum that was needed in order to conduct a prayer service. You might recognize the word the minyan. And so this is our very first verse here, Psalm 5:8. But the idea of entering into the house and prostrating or bending one's knee in awe and reverence to God in His holy sanctuary. So even though it's the prayer that you say, it's not an abstract thing. It has a concrete meaning, and it takes us all the way back to the time of nomadic life. And really, it takes us all the way back to the Garden of Eden, Gan Eden, because this was the same approach. One entered into His presence, entering into His house. He always had a house. And so this is kind of key. Now, the second verse in this particular prayer, Psalm 26:8, says, "I love the house where you dwell and the place where your glory resides." So you can see how this particular quote from Psalm really matches what we're talking about here, that loving the house where you dwell. It's the house where God's presence is, where His glory resides, and the place that you can approach and meet God. And again, the emphasis being on God dwelling among His people. Not that He's somewhere high up in heaven, wherever that's located, outside, the dimension of time that we can't touch. He's far away. He doesn't care about humanity and what is going on. No, He comes from His lofty place, and He dwells in the presence among His people. His presence is among His people. They don't have to reach Him, but as long as they make the effort to approach Him in the right way, He comes and dwells among them. He's not in some distant location where people can't find Him. And so we can always enter into the glory of His presence. I find it, if you think about the talit, it's kind of interesting because the men would sort of put that on their head and create this little room for themselves. It's just between him and God, as the talit forms kind of the house, so that one can enter into the presence of God and God's presence enter into that house. The next verse is from Psalm 95:6. "I shall prostrate myself and bow. I shall kneel before the Lord my Maker." So we have our three positions of worship mentioned in this verse: to prostrate, to bow, and to kneel, all from that root word barak, beit resh kaf, baruch, you might recognize. And it is said that the three positions of worship correspond to the three services: the morning service, the afternoon service, and the evening service, and point to the three patriarchs as well: Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, this is our next verse from Psalm 69:14. "As for me, may my prayer to you, Adonai, be at an opportune time. O God, in your abundant kindness, answer me with the truth of your salvation." So the opportune time, or the appointed time, would have been the time of the burnt offering. And that was the time in which one met God, those appointed times in the morning and the afternoon, the shacharit and the mincha service. And even as I've gone through the service itself and through these various prayers, there are many uses of the word salvation, which we know in Hebrew is Yeshua, or a variation of His name, pointing to the concept of salvation through all of this. Now, from Romans 12:1, it says, "I exhort you, brothers, in view of God's mercies, to offer yourselves as a living sacrifice and set apart to God. This will please Him. It is your logical temple worship. So now we arrive at the time we have no temple, we have no central sanctuary, we have no central institution, we have people scattered all over the world praying at the time of prayer, but God will still enter into the presence of his people even when they're scattered. So the community still exists even though it's physically separated, and God is able to be in our midst no matter where we are. He can dwell among his people no matter where we are. We have kind of an overemphasis, I think, in America on the idea of us individual personally being this temple where everything functions. But really, it is the whole community that functions as the body in the place that God's presence dwells. That's kind of key. This from 1 Corinthians 3:16, it says, "Don't you know that you people are God's temple, and God's Spirit lives in you? God's temple is holy, and you yourselves are that temple." So the you people thing, yes, it has an individual aspect to it, but it is really speaking of a community. You as a community. Now we have a community of believers in all different cities and towns and locations all over the globe, but still God comes and dwells in his presence dwells in our midst. It's really quite remarkable. Of course, God's temple, the place of his presence, is a holy place. It is a place where the community is unified. And in the Jewish community, when they enter into the synagogue as the place of his presence, there's great expressions of joy and reverence because they are able to enter in. And so that's the same sort of expression that we need to have of joy every morning and reverence for God when we enter into his presence in prayer. And so part of the prayers are how we approach. Part of the prayers is the attitude of our heart before it is even the time to worship God. We're not even really yet, if you will, in terms of the service at that place where we're worshiping. We're just preparing to worship him. It's interesting when you read some of the sages, they'll say that really the men of old would literally pray for an hour in order to prepare themselves to begin to pray. So not even getting to the prayer part, they're already praying for an hour, preparing their hearts. Psalm 100 is also, verse 4 is also an expression of this particular prayer, Ma Tov. Psalm 95, let us come into his presence with thanksgiving. Let us shout for joy to him with songs of praise. So you can see that's kind of meant to be literally. And again, back to Psalm 100, enter his presence with joyful songs, enter his gates with thanksgiving, enter his courts with praise. So I want you to see how this is really a physical, concrete manifestation of this. You're literally entering into his presence. You are literally entering into the gates of the temple. You were literally entering into the various courtyards depending on what service was being performed. So we've taken this concrete model and we've made it abstract, but then we've forgotten where the root of it has come from, that it has a literal meaning, if you will. Now, from Matthew 6:6, you might recognize that. Now, all this is sort of well understood, and by the time of the first century, by the time of Yeshua, this idea of entering into the tents. But what it says in Matthew 6:6, when you pray, enter into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father in secret. So, of course, that can certainly mean a literal room in your house. But it can also, when we talked about the talit, wearing the prayer shawl and covering oneself as if one entered into their room and closed off everything, and it was just a time of secret prayer, if you will, between the Father and you. And there must be that expression between you and the Father, that very personal sort of secret place. Again, just emphasizing the idea, imagining yourself in the morning entering into the temple courtyards. And in fact, the temple itself was an idiom that the sages say for the pasture. So you think about the patriarchs moving from place to place looking for green pastures, and that the temple was an idiom for that pasture. So the idea of lying down in green pastures, the place of the presence of God. So we're going to wind up this particular session, if you will. John 10:9 will be a verse that now maybe makes more sense if Yeshua was actually the tent door to the place of the presence of God. I am the gate. If someone enters through me, he will be safe and will go in and out and find green pasture. I have come so they may have life and have it in abundance. So you see, all this, the things that Yeshua is declaring are based on physical, concrete things. And so these illusions are all in there, that he is the tent door. He is the way through into the presence of God. He was the entrance into the sheepfold being a picture of the temple. And finally here in Hebrews 4:13, for the one who has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. So entering into the temple, entering into the place of the presence of God, entering into that pasture where we can find rest from Psalm 23, for instance, the Sabbath rest, Shabbat rest, and a time really pointing to the time of Messiah's atonement, the sort of spiritually entering into God's rest, that he has made a way in this physical world for us to have rest and to enter into his presence. And certainly part of that entering into his presence has certain requirements that go with it in a personal and corporate way. So next time we'll be leaving this portion of talking about Ma Tov, or the entering into the gates, and we're going to start talking about what it means as the priests had to prepare themselves to wash their hands and feet. We'll see you then. Shalom.